John Noe unveils Greater Than We Believe with your host, Stephen King.
Hi there. Welcome back. This is Stephen King and my friend John Noe. We are putting on a continuing Bible teaching series called Greater Than We Believe. We've had over 2 years worth of videos posted already. We are working this week on video number 126. We have a subsection here of that called The Divine Solution, Unifying End-Time Views. And end-time views, that subject can be very divisive, and we're trying to help us come up with something, unify us all completely.
Yes.
This last week, John spoke about the dispensational premill view, and there's a couple of offshoots of that, and one's called the classic, and one's called the progressive premill views. So, John, confuse us totally. Help us to understand what they are and why they're there, and then we can move on from there with the other views of end-time prophecy.
First, let me start with a warning.
Okay.
To our viewers out there. Warning. This video is going to be confusing and boring. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
But, it's necessary to show you the weaknesses of this popular view.
Right.
And we're going to show you the weaknesses being exposed by people within that view.
Right.
Consider it weak and problematic.
Yes.
And this is somewhat technical, and I'm only going to be exposing, you might say, the tip of the iceberg.
Yes.
On this. But at least it'll give you a feel for how confused dispensationalists are themselves.
Yes.
About what their own view says. So, and some others. Okay, so before premillennial dispensational view, which pretty much started in the 1830s, was the classic or historical premillennialism. And it's kind of a variation, but it preceded that. So it holds that the rapture and the second coming are not two-stage event or not two separate events, but they occur together and are indistinguishable as part of one event. Furthermore, this single and climactic event takes place at the end of the tribulation period, not beginning or middle or whatever as the other one holds. Hence, the church will go through the tribulation. Bad news. Bad news. Spoiler alert. Spoiler alert. Of the Antichrist.
Yes.
Before Christ returns and fights the battle of Armageddon and witnesses the rising of the dead believers and begins his millennial reign on earth. And this reign, however, is not seen as Jewish-oriented, but will include both Jews and Gentiles. And the millennium will be followed by the loosing of Satan, the final rebellion, the resurrection, and the judgment of the wicked, all of which are future. And the final state in which sin, evil, and death will no longer exist on planet Earth. Why didn't God set it up like this in the first place?
He should have.
I mean, isn't he all-powerful?
It's supposed to be.
Well, how did this faux pas happen? Additionally, historic premillennialists do not hold to the classic dispensational distinction of a difference between Israel and the church, nor to the idea that the kingdom was postponed or put on hold. Now, those are major disagreements within premillennialism.
Right.
All right, let's now move into the what's called progressive dispensationalism.
Yes.
And this has been necessitated because, as Sariah talks about in The End of All Things, even those within dispensationalism are seeing the need to rethink much of what has been taught for years now. A third variation called, or excuse me, that Sariah also took. He said, since about the middle of the 20th century, Sariah dates
Okay.
the arising of the progressive dispensationalism. Erickson, let's see, in his book, A Basic Guide to Eschatology, says there has arisen a variety called progressive dispensationalism. Now, he's a postmillennialist. And its introduction, according to Poitras, has made the theological picture still more complex. And we're going to see that complexity in just a second. Classic dispensationalist John Master states that until the advent of progressive dispensationalism, sine qua non, meaning the main thing of dispensationalism, as stated by Ryrie, was the literal interpretation and distinction between Israel and the church and the unifying theme of the glory of God. And this was widely accepted and providing the critical identifying markers. At this point, however, all these criteria are now being questioned by the progressive dispensationalists as whether or not they're essential to dispensationalism. The crossover on every point made it difficult to distinguish, he says, who is a dispensationalist and who isn't. Craig Blazing, one of the chief progressive proponents, describes this emerging variation as a modification. And he calls it various modifications, while Blaze and Brock, other two progressive dispensationalists, together recognize that it's not easy to classify all the differences between various dispensational theologians. In other words, it's a mess.
It is.
It's a mess of confusion. They distinguish three phases of dispensational thought: classic, revised, and progressive, as a movement of gradual modification. And they further characterize progressives as rethinking and reinterpreting the beliefs of dispensationalism. Basically, progressive dispensationalists seem to be a blending or amalgamation between the two above premillennial varieties, the historic variety and then the premill dispensational, the popular variety. Millard Erickson, again in his book, A Basic Guide of Eschatology, analyzes this movement and says that while refining or even abandoning some of the tenets of dispensationalism, they maintain and they preserve the distinctive features of that system of thought, however. And key for progressives is their attempt to soften or modify, as they say, the two major distinctives of a dichotomy between Israel and the church and regarding the literal interpretation of the Bible. At the same time, however, they try to retain each of those as somehow, in some sense. Hoke explains in his book, All Things New, explains that progressives like historical premillennialists and amillennialists retain the emphasis on one people of God as opposed to two peoples of God. The distinctive nature of Pentecost as establishment of the church and the non-Jewish millennium, as opposed to being a Jewish millennium. At the same time, they embrace the classic dispensational idea that Israel always refers to the physical descendants of Abraham, yet they reject its racial discontinuity between Israel and the church, and a rigid definition rigid definition of the kingdom. Hence, for progressives, Israel and the church are distinct in some ways, while they are also overlapped to significant ways. Confusing, isn't it?
Yes.
The result is the church is now on equal basis with Israel. That's not what we've been hearing, is it? But Israel has priority in terms of privilege. What? But not priority in terms of program. What? Are you confused yet? In keeping with this mediation, the classic dispensational periods of time and history are viewed as progressive of grace rather than being separate and distinct. Likewise, progressives' view of biblical covenants in the church has also been modified to a more already not yet perspective. Hence, they see present blessings as a partial fulfillment, with complete fulfillment coming at Christ's return. Hoke elaborates that progressives believe all of God's covenants will be fulfilled eschatologically, both in the church and in Israel, for those who turn to Christ in faith. But he confesses that unlike classic dispensationalists, progressives are just not quite certain how the whole process works out eschatologically. The bottom line is progressives have moved toward a historic premillennial and amillennial positions. Thus, they can allow fulfillment of Old Testament promises and covenants at least partially to the church without making Israel and church synonymous. Did you understand that?
Mm-mm.
Hoke adds that the key is the remnant of Israel, Jewish believers within the church. While Blaze and Block admit that there has been a gradual revision of early dispensationalism dualism, Masters notes that some measure of distinction between the church and Israel has been maintained, but Blaze and Block are also proposed an eventual abandonment of it. I mean, now this is all infighting of the two distinctive purposes and two people's theories of classic dispensationalism. Again, this is in line with historic premillennialism. They also have discarded the classic idea of different kingdoms in favor of one promised eschatological kingdom, which has both spiritual and political dimensions. But they are now unsure how the full establishment of the kingdom on earth in its intermediate millennial form and what will come 1,000 years later in its everlasting form. Did you get that?
Oh, yeah.
Meanwhile, the church is in mystery form.
Yeah.
You understand that?
Oh, yeah.
Of the kingdom.
We're not supposed to understand these things.
As well as a phase of the eschatological kingdom and a manifestation of grace, but a future tribulation period still forms the setting for Jesus' return. Man. Additionally, the famed literal hermeneutic for all Scripture, including prophecy, has been called into question and is in a state of flux. Well, no kidding.
Really?
You just heard some of the state of flux. Masters concludes, and I'm almost done. Masters concludes that today the situation is not nearly so simple or clear-cut. Well, no kidding. For instance, he argues that a consistent literal hermeneutic does not determine in prophecy when something is real and when it is not. So are they proposing a lot of stuff that is not?
Who knows?
Yes, they are. If something is metaphor or failure to interpret it as such would not be considered normal or literal hermeneutic. Understand that? Adding to these difficulties, in his opinion, is the realization that differences may emerge concerning the amount of metaphor in Old Testament prophecy. You know what a metaphor is for?
Making a point, like an illustration.
Yeah. What's a metaphor for?
Yeah.
Not surprisingly, criticism of this new variation comes from both inside and outside the premillennial view. Well, we just heard the inside stuff. From inside, for example, classic dispensationalist Thomas condemns, big difference, this new approach. He states that it is a system that attempts to combine preterism, idealism, and immanency into itself. Hey, I think I could agree with that, on a synthesis type approach, and we'll get into more of that. He might be onto something here.
Yeah.
Well, he hadn't received too well.
Yeah.
He believes it creates a complex mixture of hermeneutical principles.
Yes.
In his opinion, this mixture runs counter to what traditional grammatical historical disciplines dictate. Uh-oh.
Uh-oh. Red flag.
From outside, postmillennialist and partial preterist Gary DeMar chides this new variation in writing when the dispensationalists deal with the time texts that point to the near coming of Christ in judgment in the first century. Until this question is answered, the new dispensationalism is still the old dispensationalism. More, on the other hand, in writing a chapter in this book, Looking into the Future, edited by David Baker, is quite lenient when he cites its chief weakness as being its newness. That I mean is right. And he feels that it offers opportunity for exploration and perhaps implementation. Well, let me also say that this also offers opportunity for its abolition. Erickson speaks of the problems because progressives have so modified the dispensational hermeneutic that they are in danger of slipping into amillennialism. Ooh, man, I mean, that's bad news for dispensationalists. Slipping into amillennialism. Those are fighting words. Amillennialist Poitras agrees and can imagine a further transition all the way into the amillennial position for dispensationalists. Bach feeds this influx participation in an article titled Why I Am a Dispensationalist with a Small D. As a result of progressive dispensationalism today, and this is putting it mildly, is in a state of fluidity. I would say in a state of disarray. Even Brazing and Block admit that they have not solved all the interpretive problems and that the work of progressives is ongoing, and that much more work remains to be done in light of this fluidity. So what is the future for dispensationalism? The answer is, according to Masters, I don't know. But I know. I do know. I do know, folks.
Okay.
There's an answer to all this.
Yeah.
Confusion.
Yeah.
And disarray. And that answer is to be discarded. Most of it, with a few minor exceptions, is to majorly be discredited, first of all.
Sure.
And discarded. And not included in a synthesis, a divine synthesis in a solution to this mess and maze. And I hope you were able to bear with me as I just gave you some flavor from their own words of what these dispensationalists are doing to their own view. But still, dispensational premillennial is the number one view held by most Christians in this country of America and in most countries around the world. Sad to say.
Yep.
Next. The post-millennial view that brought our forefathers in the country to this country to establish his great institutions.
Okay. Thank you, John. Well, that's confusing, to say the least.
Don't ask me to recap it.
But I honestly, though, I think that the reason why it is so well received and so believed by so many right now is just because so many people just accept things as they're told. Their pastor gets up at the pulpit and says, this is what we believe, and doesn't bother to tell them any proof or anything to back it up. He said, this is just it. And they figure, well, this guy went to seminary and he went to college and I didn't. He must be smarter than me, so I guess he must be right. I'll just trust that he knows what he's talking about. So if someone else presents something different, they say, well, I don't know you, but I know my pastor and I trust him, so I'm not going to trust what you say. And very few people go to the trouble of study and anymore. So hopefully this series that we're putting on, and this particular part of the series, though it may seem boring and tedious at some points, it has to be so that you can see the problem.
And this is with the theologians, the scholars, the academia people. They're confused.
Yes.
And their language betrays them.
Yes. Well, John we had a video, it's been a while back, but John was talking about how do I put this? We have a tendency sometimes to think that people that are scholars and have all the little letters after their names and have all the accolades of the world, that they must know what they're talking about. And anybody like me, who am I? I'm nobody. I mean, literally nobody. I didn't even go to college or anything. But so there's nothing I could say that against what they say that could possibly be right. because I don't have the learning that they have. But it's amazing how God has consistently through the Bible used the simple things to confound those that thought they were somebody.
Here's an example.
Yeah.
Tell me who said this.
Okay.
Verily, verily, I tell you the truth. This generation shall not pass away until some of these things have happened.
No one ever said that. It is an adulteration of what Jesus said, but that seems to be what the pastors and a lot of clergy think.
All right.
That's what you have to take that.
How about this?
Okay.
If you can't say something simple, first of all, that's not good grammar.
No.
But it's great philosophy.
Yeah.
If you can't say something simple, you don't understand it well enough.
Yeah, well, no. I've heard that always. It's just if you can't explain something, you don't understand it. Well, that's not necessarily true. I mean, it's...
I'm saying, if you can't say it simple.
Yeah.
How about this for simple? Everything Jesus said happened.
Yes.
Exactly as and when he said.
Yes.
And exactly as and when every New Testament writer expected it to.
Yes.
As they were guided into all truth by the Holy Spirit.
That I can get on board with.
Isn't that
There's a beauty in simplicity. There really is.
Yes. There's truth in simplicity.
You know that expression they say, KISS, K-I-S-S, keep it simple, stupid. Well, there's a lot of beauty in just keeping it simple. And so...
And doesn't that contrast with what we just went through?
Yes. Now, there are honest...
And I apologize for having to put you through that.
But there's a lot of deep things in the Word. There's a lot of meat where it takes real digestive study to get through the meat. And I love that. And I'm glad that there are deep things that we can go for. But I'm not glad that it's not all just milk. But what's happening is we are being fed this as milk. As this, just believe it. This is what you need to know. When this is not only not milk, it's not truth. So anyway, we will hope that you will come back next week and join us as the discussion continues. Pray for our ministry, please. We pray for you. God bless you all. We'll see you next week. Good night. All right.